Henry VIII's name echoes through history as one of England's most infamous kings, known for his 6 marriages and the radical changes he brought to the country. But behind the crown lies a man whose thirst for power and legacy reshaped a nation. A king who wasn't afraid to break all the rules, even if it meant defying the most powerful religious institution of the time, the Catholic Church. Henry's quest for a male heir led him down a path of controversy, heartache, and political upheaval. His actions didn't just affect his wives, they altered the course of English history forever. The split from Rome, the formation of a new church, and the execution of queens were all driven by his relentless need to secure his dynasty. Each marriage came with consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls, changing the lives of thousands and leading to a new era for England. In this video, we will take a closer look at the man behind these monumental changes. What drove Henry VIII to risk everything for a son? And how did his choices leave a legacy that continues to influence the country centuries later? Early years. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Kent. He was the 3rd child and 2nd son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Of Henry's many siblings, only 3 survived infancy. His brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, and his sisters Margaret and Mary. Shortly after his birth, Henry was baptized by Richard Fox, the Bishop of Exeter, at a church near the palace. At just 2 years old, Henry was given the title of Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. By the age of 3, he was made Earl Marshal of England and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and shortly after, he became a Knight of the Bath. In 1494, he was also named Duke of York and Warden of the Scottish Marches. Though these positions were largely symbolic due to his young age, they allowed his father to maintain control of important and profitable offices. Not much is known about Henry's early life because he wasn't expected to become king. However, it is clear he received an excellent education, becoming fluent in Latin and French, and learning some Italian. In November 1501, Henry took part in the ceremony surrounding his older brother Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Henry, then Duke of York, continued to receive honors, including being made a Knight of the Golden Fleece by Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in 1506. Tragedy struck in 1502 when Arthur died suddenly at the age of 15, just months after marrying Catherine. This unexpected loss put young Henry in line for the throne. At just 10 years old, he became Duke of Cornwall, and 2 years later, he was named Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. Despite his new responsibilities, his father kept Henry closely supervised, giving him few duties, which meant he had little training when he eventually became king. After Arthur's death, Henry VII sought to maintain the alliance between England and Spain by arranging a marriage between Henry and Arthur's widow, Catherine. The two were betrothed, but Henry rejected the marriage when he turned 14. Catherine remained in England, holding on to the belief that it was her destiny to marry Henry. Even as the political situation between England and Spain became more complicated after the death of her mother, Isabella of Castile. Early reign. Henry VII passed away in April 1509, and his 17-year-old son, Henry, became king. Just after his father's burial on May 10, Henry unexpectedly announced that he would marry Catherine of Aragon. Despite unresolved issues about the papal approval and some of her dowry still missing, Henry claimed that it was his father's dying wish for him to marry Catherine. Whether this was true or not, it suited Henry's plans, especially as Emperor Maximilian I had been hoping to marry his granddaughter Eleanor to Henry, but now she had been rejected. Henry and Catherine had a quiet wedding at a church in Greenwich on June 11, 1509. Soon after, on June 23, Henry and the 23-year-old Catherine were led from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey for their grand coronation. The streets were decorated with fine cloth and tapestries to celebrate the occasion. Following the coronation, a magnificent banquet was held at Westminster Hall. Catherine later wrote to her father, describing how their lives were filled with continuous celebrations. 2 days after being crowned, Henry arrested 2 of his father's most unpopular ministers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, and later had them executed in 1510. This method of dealing with opponents through execution would become a common practice throughout Henry's reign. On the other hand, Henry showed some leniency toward the House of York, pardoning several people imprisoned by his father. However, not all were forgiven. Edmund de la Pole, for example, was executed in 1513 after his brother sided against the king. Shortly after their marriage, Catherine became pregnant but tragically gave birth to a stillborn daughter in January 1510. She soon conceived again, and on January 1, 1511, a son named Henry was born. Their joy was short-lived, as the child died just 7 weeks later. Catherine had more pregnancies, but only one child, Mary, born in 1516, survived. Despite some tension between the couple, the birth of Mary improved their relationship somewhat. Though Henry's marriage to Catherine was seen as a relatively good one, Henry did take mistresses. One of the most notable affairs was with Elizabeth Blount, who gave birth to Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, in 1519. Fitzroy was made Duke of Richmond in 1525, sparking speculation about his potential legitimization. However, Fitzroy died in 1536 without having any children. France and the Habsburgs. In 1510, France, with a fragile alliance alongside the Holy Roman Empire through the League of Cambrai, was winning a war against Venice. Henry renewed the friendship his father had with Louis XII of France, which caused division within his council. Facing a potential war against both France and the Holy Roman Empire would have been incredibly difficult. However, Henry soon signed a pact with Ferdinand II of Aragon. When Pope Julius II created the anti-French Holy League in October 1511, Henry followed Ferdinand's lead and brought England into the alliance. Together, they planned an attack in the spring to reclaim Aquitaine for England, a step toward Henry's goal of ruling France. But after declaring war in April 1512, the attack was a failure, as Ferdinand used it for his own advantage, putting a strain on the alliance. Even so, the French were soon pushed out of Italy, and the partnership remained intact, with both sides eager for more victories. Henry then managed a diplomatic success by convincing Emperor Maximilian to join the Holy League. Remarkably, Pope Julius promised Henry the title of Most Christian King of France. And possibly even a coronation in Paris, but only if Louis XII could be defeated. On June 30, 1513, Henry invaded France, leading his troops to a victory over the French at the Battle of the Spurs. Although the battle wasn't significant, it was used heavily in English propaganda. The English soon captured Therouanne and gave it to Maximilian, followed by taking Tournai, a more important city. Henry led the army personally, accompanied by a large entourage. Meanwhile, his brother-in-law, James IV of Scotland, invaded England at Louis's request. However, the English, under Queen Catherine's oversight, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Flodden on September 9, 1513. James IV was among the dead, putting an end to Scotland's brief involvement in the war. These campaigns gave Henry a taste of military success, but despite early enthusiasm, he chose not to pursue another campaign in 1514. He had financially supported Ferdinand and Maximilian, but had received little in return, leaving England's treasury nearly empty. With Pope Leo X replacing Julius and favoring peace with France, Henry agreed to a treaty with Louis. His sister Mary married Louis, securing peace for 8 years, an unusually long time. Charles V, nephew of Henry's wife Catherine, became King of Spain in 1516 and Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, while Francis I succeeded Louis XII in 1515. This brought 3 young rulers into power, offering a fresh start in European politics. Cardinal Wolsey's diplomacy led to the Treaty of London in 1518, aiming to unite the Western kingdoms against the Ottoman Empire. Henry met Francis on June 7, 1520, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold for 2 weeks of lavish events, hoping for friendly relations. However, rivalry between the two kings made further cooperation impossible, and conflict was inevitable. Henry found more common ground with Charles V, whom he met both before and after seeing Francis. By 1521, Charles brought his empire into war with France. Though Henry tried to mediate, he eventually sided with Charles. His ambition of reclaiming English lands in France remained, but he sought to secure Burgundy, which was under Charles's control, along with the emperor's continued support. A small English attack in northern France achieved little. When Charles captured Francis at the Battle of Pavia, he could dictate the terms of peace but gave Henry nothing. Realizing this, Henry decided to withdraw England from the conflict, signing the Treaty of the Moor on August 30, 1525. Marriages. During his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII had an affair with Mary Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Some believe that Mary's two children, Henry Carey and Catherine Carey, might have been fathered by Henry, but this was never confirmed. Unlike his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, the king never acknowledged them. By 1525, Henry grew frustrated with Catherine's inability to give him a male heir. Around this time, he became attracted to Mary's sister, Anne Boleyn, a lively young woman in the Queen's circle. Anne, however, refused to become Henry's mistress, as her sister had. This rejection only increased Henry's desire to pursue her. At this point, Henry started to think seriously about securing a male heir, and three possible options came to mind. He could legitimize his son Henry Fitzroy, marry off his daughter Mary quickly in the hope of a male grandchild, or annul his marriage to Catherine and remarry. Henry chose the third option, as he saw and as the key to having a male heir. Despite being a devout Catholic early in his reign, Henry's attitude toward his marriage shifted. By 1527, he had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's wife, and he used a passage from the Bible, Leviticus 20 verse 21, as justification. Henry argued that the Pope had no authority to approve their marriage, and he appealed to Pope Clement VII to annul it. However, the Pope, under pressure from Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine's nephew, was not willing to grant Henry's request. Henry tried various diplomatic methods, even sending his secretary to Rome with a proposal, but the Pope refused. Later, an ecclesiastical court was arranged in England, but it also failed to side with Henry. This was largely due to the influence of Charles V, and by mid-1529, the case was recalled to Rome, leaving Henry without an annulment. As a result of this failure, Henry blamed Cardinal Wolsey, who had been his key advisor. Wolsey was charged with praemunire, a crime against royal authority, in October 1529 and eventually died in 1530 while awaiting trial for treason. Following Wolsey's downfall, Sir Thomas More became Lord Chancellor, though he too was opposed to the annulment. By 1531, Catherine was removed from the court, and her rooms were given to Anne Boleyn. Anne, who was more educated than most women of her time, was drawn to the ideas of the Protestant Reformation. When Archbishop William Warham passed away, Anne played a role in securing Thomas Cranmer's appointment as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, a move that helped Henry in his quest for an annulment. Henry's marriage to Catherine lasted for 24 years, and their separation left a lasting impact on him. It was said to have been a deeply painful and isolating experience. Marriage to Anne Boleyn. In the winter of 1532, Henry met with Francis I at Calais to secure support for his new marriage. Shortly after returning to England, Henry, at 41 years old, secretly married Anne. She became pregnant soon after, and a second wedding took place in London on January 25, 1533. On May 23, 1533, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. And 5 days later, he confirmed Henry and Anne's marriage as legitimate. Catherine lost her title as queen and became Princess Dowager, while Anne was crowned queen on June 1, 1533. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, named after Henry's mother. Following the marriage, a series of reforms were introduced to address remaining issues, protect the changes, and deal with opposition. These acts were largely driven by Thomas Cromwell and supported by Henry. In 1532, Sir Thomas More resigned as Lord Chancellor, leaving Cromwell as Henry's key minister. The Act of Succession in 1533 declared Henry's marriage to Anne legitimate, making her offspring next in line, while Catherine's daughter Mary was declared illegitimate. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 confirmed Henry as the head of the Church in England. Following this, the Pope excommunicated Henry and Cranmer. Despite the initial excitement, Henry and Anne's marriage was far from happy. Anne's strong personality, which had once attracted Henry, became a point of contention. Her inability to produce a male heir only worsened the situation. In 1534, Anne had a miscarriage, and by the end of that year, Henry was already contemplating how to end the marriage without reconciling with Catherine. Meanwhile, Henry began having an affair with either Madge Shelton or her sister, Mary, as some historians believe. Opposition to Henry's religious policies was swiftly dealt with. John Fisher and Thomas More refused to take the oath recognizing Henry's supremacy over the Church, leading to their conviction for treason and execution in 1535. Suppressing resistance to his reforms led to larger rebellions, such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, where rebels in northern England were promised pardons. However, Henry saw them as traitors and executed their leaders, including Robert Aske. On January 8, 1536, Henry learned of Catherine of Aragon's death. Shortly after, Anne suffered a miscarriage, losing a male child, which marked a turning point in their relationship. Anne's family still held important roles in court, but her influence waned as Henry shifted his favor towards France as emperor. And supporters of Catherine's daughter, Mary, gained influence. A second annulment became a real possibility. And some believe Cromwell played a role in Anne's downfall. Anne's fall from grace began with accusations of conspiracy, adultery, and other charges. Henry's new mistress, Jane Seymour, was moved into more favorable quarters, signaling Anne's fading influence. Between April 30th and May 2, 1536, several men, including Anne's brother, were arrested for treason and accused of relations with the Queen. Despite questionable evidence, they were all found guilty and executed. On May 17, 1536, Henry and Anne's marriage was annulled, and on May 19, Anne was executed at the Tower of London. Marriage to Jane Seymour, Domestic and Foreign Affairs. The day after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry, then 45 years old, became engaged to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. 10 days later, they were married at the Palace of Whitehall by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. At the time, Charles V was occupied with internal matters, and Henry was on fairly good terms with Francis of France, which allowed Henry to focus more on domestic affairs. In 1536, Henry approved the Laws in Wales Act, which officially united England and Wales as one nation. That same year, he also passed the Second Succession Act, which declared that any children he had with Jane would be next in line for the throne. This act also excluded both Mary and Elizabeth by declaring them illegitimate, while giving Henry the power to decide the succession in his will if he had no further children. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward, who would later become King Edward VI. Unfortunately, Jane died from complications on October 24, just days after Edward's birth. Though Henry felt the loss over time, he seemed to recover quickly. And plans were soon underway to find him another wife, this time with a focus on the European continent. In 1538, Cromwell proposed a series of marriages as part of a treaty with Charles V. Among the ideas was a marriage for Henry to Christina, the Dowager Duchess of Milan, and alliances for his children, including Edward's potential marriage to one of Charles's daughters. However, when Charles and Francis made peace in 1539, Henry became increasingly anxious. With Cromwell's reports of possible threats, Henry fortified his defenses, using the wealth gained from dissolving the monasteries to build coastal fortifications. Cromwell later suggested Anne of Cleves as a bride for Henry. And, the 25-year-old sister of the Duke of Cleves, was considered a valuable ally in case of a Roman Catholic threat. After seeing a flattering portrait of Anne by Hans Holbein the Younger, and encouraged by reports from his courtiers, Henry agreed to marry her. But when Henry finally met Anne in person, he was disappointed with her appearance. He told his courtiers that the descriptions he had been given didn't match the reality, saying he was embarrassed by how much she had been praised. However, since the plans were already set, Henry went through with the wedding in January 1540. The marriage, though, was never consummated. The day after their wedding night, Henry complained to Cromwell, saying he found Anne unattractive and questioned whether she had even been a virgin. He made it clear that he wanted to end the marriage, and didn't contest the annulment, confirming that their marriage had never been consummated. Her earlier betrothal to Francis of Lorraine gave additional grounds for dissolving the marriage. By July 1540, the marriage was officially over, and Anne was given the title of the King's Sister, along with 2 houses and a generous allowance. Marriage to Catherine Howard, and fall of Thomas Cromwell. It soon became clear that Henry had fallen for 17-year-old Catherine Howard, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk. This worried Thomas Cromwell because Norfolk was his political rival. Not long after, religious reformers Robert Barnes, William Jerome, and Thomas Garrett, who were supported by Cromwell, were burned as heretics. Meanwhile, Cromwell himself began to lose favor, though the reasons for this aren't entirely clear. Despite his involvement in arranging Henry's failed marriage to Anne of Cleves, he was never formally accused of causing it. However, Cromwell was surrounded by enemies at court, and Norfolk, through Catherine's influence, became more powerful. Cromwell was charged with treason for various offenses, including issuing export licenses and commissions without approval, and possibly for the failed foreign policies connected to Henry's marriage to Anne. He was executed soon after. On the same day, July 28, 1540, Henry married Catherine Howard. He was thrilled with his new young queen and showered her with lands and jewelry. However, soon after their marriage, Catherine began an affair with Thomas Culpeper. She also employed Francis Derham, a man she had been involved with before her marriage, as her secretary. While Henry was away, the Privy Council was informed of her past with Derham, and Thomas Cranmer was sent to investigate. When evidence of Catherine's previous relationship with Derham was brought to Henry, he initially refused to believe it, but Derham confessed. After further investigation, Henry became enraged and took comfort in hunting. Catherine could have claimed that her earlier engagement to Derham made her marriage to Henry invalid, but she instead said that Derham had forced her into the relationship. In retaliation, Derham exposed her affair with Culpeper. Both men were executed, and Catherine was beheaded on February 13, 1542. Henry's final marriage was to Catherine Parr in July 1543. A wealthy widow with reformist beliefs, she often debated with Henry over religion. While Henry remained attached to a mix of Catholic and Protestant ideas, Parr played a key role in restoring his relationships with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. In 1543, the Third Succession Act reinstated both daughters in the line of succession after Edward. This act also allowed Henry to control the succession further in his will. Shrines destroyed and monasteries dissolved. In 1538, Thomas Cromwell led a major campaign against what the government called idolatry, which was associated with the old religion. This campaign ended with the dismantling of the Shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral in September. As a result, Pope Paul III excommunicated Henry on December 17 of that year. By 1540, Henry approved the complete destruction of shrines dedicated to saints. Then, in 1542, all remaining monasteries in England were dissolved, and their lands were taken over by the Crown. This change meant that abbots and priors lost their positions in the House of Lords. For the first time, the Lords' spiritual, clergy members who had seats in the House of Lords, were outnumbered by the Lords temporal, who were not members of the clergy. Second invasion of France and the rough wooing of Scotland. The 1539 alliance between Francis and Charles eventually fell apart and led to renewed conflict. With Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn both gone, relations between Charles and Henry improved. Henry secretly allied with the Emperor and planned to join the Italian war on his new ally's side. An invasion of France was scheduled for 1543. To prepare, Henry aimed to neutralize the threat from Scotland under his young nephew, James V. The Scots were defeated at the Battle of Solway Moss on November 24, 1542, and James died on December 15. Henry hoped to unite England and Scotland by marrying his son Edward to James's successor, Mary. The Scottish regent, Lord Arran, agreed to the marriage in the Treaty of Greenwich on July 1, 1543, but the Scottish Parliament rejected it on December 11. This led to 8 years of conflict between England and Scotland, known as the Rough Wooing. Despite several peace treaties, unrest continued in Scotland until Henry's death. Even with initial success in Scotland, Henry was reluctant to invade France, which frustrated Charles. Henry finally launched an attack on France in June 1544 with two separate forces. One force, led by Norfolk, unsuccessfully besieged Montreuil, while the other, led by Suffolk, laid siege to Boulogne. Henry later took direct control and Boulogne fell on September 18, 1544. However, Henry refused Charles's request to march on Paris. Charles's own campaign stalled, and he made peace with France on the same day. Henry was left isolated against France and was unable to secure peace on his own. Francis attempted to invade England in the summer of 1545 but was repelled at the Battle of the Solent, reaching only the Isle of Wight. Facing financial strain, France and England signed the Treaty of Camp on June 7, 1546. Henry kept Boulogne for 8 years, after which it would be returned to France for 2 million crowns, £750,000. Henry needed the money, as the 1544 campaign had cost £650,000, and England was again on the brink of bankruptcy. Physical decline and death. In his later years, Henry VIII became very obese, with a waist measuring 54 inches, 140 centimeters. He required mechanical devices to help him move and suffered from painful, pus-filled boils and possibly gout. His health problems were largely due to a jousting accident on January 24, 1536, which reopened an old leg wound and made it difficult for doctors to treat. This chronic injury festered and became ulcerated, limiting his physical activity. The accident is also believed to have contributed to Henry's mood swings, which may have significantly affected his personality and temperament. A suit of armor commissioned around 1544 shows that by then, Henry's midsection had a girth of 51 inches. Most historians have dismissed the idea that Henry had syphilis. Some believe his health issues were due to scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables. A 2010 study suggests Henry might have had a Kel-positive blood type, which could explain some of his physical and mental deterioration and high mortality rates in pregnancies attributed to him. Henry's obesity contributed to his death at age 55 on January 28, 1547, at the Palace of Whitehall, which would have been his father's 90th birthday. The elaborate tomb he planned, using parts from a tomb intended for Cardinal Wolsey, was only partially constructed and never finished. The sarcophagus and base were later repurposed for Lord Nelson's tomb in St. Paul's Cathedral. Henry was buried in a vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour. Over a century later, King Charles I was buried in the same vault. Thanks for watching. For more intriguing stories and history, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.